Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our lesson on Chapter 9 of our textbook. This week we are going to discuss modes of screen reality. And firstly, that sounds like a bit of an abstract topic, so let's discuss exactly what we mean when we're referring to modes of screen reality. Well, when we watch films, we relate to films um, using an assumption, I guess is the best way to put it, that a poet named Coleridge used to call willing suspension of disbelief. So we know that what we see up on the screen is not real. We know that what we see up on the screen is a story. We know that even in the case that we may be watching a documentary film that purports to represent real events, we know that what we're watching is a movie, that it is a constructed work of narrative art. However, we decide to accept that the movie as the reality of the moment. So we know that this is not real. We just decide that we will act as if it is real and relate to this as if it is real for the duration of the movie experience. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward. Okay, so when I'm watching a movie of students in a classroom, I'm just assuming that they're real students in a real classroom for the duration of the film. Well, the issue is not quite as simple as it may seem up front, because exactly what do we mean when we mean reality, and exactly what do we mean when we mean willing suspension of disbelief? So, when we watch The Wizard of Oz, um, we then accept, we suspend our disbelief, and act as if things like munchkins, and good witches, and bad witches, and flying monkeys, we act as if those things are real, and we respond to those things as if they were real for the duration of the film. When we're watching Bambi as a children's film, or Dumbo, we respond to the scene when Dumbo visits his mother when she's being held up in jail. That's one of the saddest scenes in the movies. One colleague of mine describes that scene as a good test for sociopathy. Um, if that doesn't make you cry your eyes out, then chances are you have a serious problem with empathy. Or the scene when Bambi's mother dies, he's running through the thicket, yelling, "Mama, Mama, Mama." Bambi's father comes up to him and says, "I have something to tell you, Bambi. Your mother won't be coming back anymore." We accept that these are real reactions that you would get from an elephant mother and her baby, or a fawn who's just learned that his mother, a doe, has died. So the issue is just a little more complicated. Do elephants relate to their children in the same way that humans do? And why do we accept that as real? Now, another thing that enters into this is that different films and different groups of films will often have a predominant mode of reality, a predominant way in which they are trying to relate to you to get you to accept this as the reality of the moment. And different modes, different ways of constructing how we experience the reality of the moment can coexist within the same film. We also, when we're watching a film, we co-construct its mode of screen reality. So the movie, again, really doesn't have any meaning until you and I, and anyone as an audience member, watches the movie and decides, wow, what I'm watching means something. Up until that point, the movie is simply dried up chemicals sitting on a strip of film. Once it's run through a projector and an audience experiences it, then it actually means something. And the ways in which different modes of screen reality are employed can change over time. And we can definitely see influences of several different modes of screen reality within a single film. Now, the basic modes of screen reality that most film writers refer to when they're writing about films are what is called realism, what is called expressionism, what is called fantasy, what is called self-reflexivity, and what is called animation. So I'm going to discuss each of these different modes of screen reality, starting off with realism. Now you'll notice through the magic of one of Méliès's early special effects that originally the header for the slide just said realism, but I've added in brackets the term illusionism. This was one of Méliès's earliest special effects. He discovered that you could make things appear to materialize out of nowhere simply by stopping the camera, putting something new in the frame, and then starting up again. All right. Why have I put this term illusionism in the place of realism? Because some film writers, like myself, we actually prefer the term illusionism to the term of realism. What realistic films attempt to offer you, again, is a depiction of the world that corresponds to your understanding of how the world really is in a manner that convinces you. Now, what a lot of film writers like myself argue, again, since this is acting on what is called your willing suspension of disbelief, what they're actually presenting you with is an illusion of reality. It's not real reality. It's not real reality. So this is what is meant by some film writers who use the term illusionism. They're talking about simply what other film writers and what many film textbooks refer to as realism, films that attempt to present the world that is depicted in the film in a manner that the viewer will simply accept as realistically as possible that corresponds to the viewer's own experience. So, the majority of dramatic films that we tend to see tend to, not to mention a lot of comic films as well, the majority of fictional films that we tend to see tend to depict the world in a mode of reality we call ordinary fictional realism. The world that is depicted in the movie corresponds to the world of our everyday experience as we understand it. So there is a naturalistic visual style. Often the film uses reverse shot editing, which is also called invisible editing. Naturalistic colors are used, so there aren't strange colors. The movie is just not drawing attention to itself as a movie. It's just trying to give you a presentation of what you believe is everyday life, or what everyday life is in your experience. It also generally has a linear narrative structure, which means that the story starts at point A, goes through various events, ends at point B, always moves forward in time, and there are very few flashbacks or flash forwards, and one consistent story is followed through the movie. So the movie does not draw attention to the fact that its story is a story. Its story simply unfolds. And thirdly, characters behave plausibly. So firstly, characters are presented as ordinary people who behave in ways that we usually see ordinary people behaving. And again, the reason why some of us call it realism and some of us call it illusionism is that this illusion of reality is meant to correspond to our everyday experience of the world, and to the world as we understand it. So just to give you a couple of examples, one of my favorite examples of this is a film called Braveheart, which was made, more than 20 years ago now, going on 25 years. It won Mel Gibson the Oscar for Best Director. It was the Best Picture of the Year, and many people praised it for its historical realism. It was a film about a war for Scottish independence, which took place, I think, in the 13th century. And the film was praised for the realism of its production design. The audience really believed that um, all of the characters were believably Scottish people from about 800 years ago. All right, there was just one little problem. Everybody in Braveheart was wearing kilts. Nobody started wearing kilts until about 300 years later in the 16th century. Secondly, when the movie depicts the actions of royalty, so of kings and queens at the time, and the king at the time is seen giving his decrees to his court in modern English. Modern English as a language did not exist 800 years ago. The version of English that people were practicing 800 years ago was a language called Middle English, which at that time would still have had strong influences of another language called Old English, and wouldn't have sounded recognizably like our contemporary English at all. But this is a bit of a moot point, since the official business of the court would have been conducted in Old French, because French at the time, in the 13th century, was the language of political leaders. So, although we might think that this movie is realistic, it's actually corresponding to our understanding of what people realistically do. So, we believe in the 21st century that, oh, Scottish people wear kilts, and the King of England will speak in the English language. So the movie presents an illusion of reality that corresponds with our understanding of reality. It's not presenting the real reality. If it was, the king would be speaking in Middle English and Old Latin, and nobody would be wearing kilts. So it's rather an illusion of reality that corresponds with what we think is real. Now, Braveheart is also noted for its historical realism. And what do we mean when we talk about historical realism in a film? So this is when a film is set in a particular historical period, and the production designers and the costume designers go to great lengths to make all of the costumes and all of the sets in the film correspond with the actual look of what people would have been wearing and how buildings would have been styled at that time. So, to give you a couple of examples on the next slide, here we have, firstly, what we would consider to be ordinary fictional realism in the top left corner of the screen. James Stewart is playing a character in a film called Rear Window. We saw a clip of it a little earlier in the screen, in the term. He's broken his leg. He's in his apartment. He's sitting in a wheelchair. This is in the 1950s. People didn't have air conditioners, so you can see that he's sweating profusely, lying in his wheelchair trying to relax. So this is ordinary fictional realism. It's supposed to be a very hot day. He has a broken leg and is unable to move, so his character is behaving plausibly. He's doing the only thing he really can do, which is to lie around in his chair and sweat a lot. Historical realism here, again, we talked a little earlier in the semester about Stanley Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon, and about basically somebody who is recognized as being the world's greatest production designer, Ken Adam, and his production design for Barry Lyndon. And here you see, again, Lady Lyndon wearing an ostrich feathered hat, as a very wealthy woman would have worn in the 18th century, and all of the lighting in the scene comes from these very ornate gold candelabras because they didn't have electric lights in the 18th century. So here we have an example of ordinary fictional realism in the top left, and here an example of historical realism in the center of the screen. Now, documentary realism actually has strong ties to what we call self-reflexivity, which I will discuss a little later on. But when we're watching a documentary film, a film that is supposedly about real events, we tend to assume, because the film is about real events, and the pictures that we see in that film are real events, that what must have occurred is real as well. So this reinforces our sense that the events are true. Now, what fictional filmmakers have often done is they have made mockumentary films. So they've made a fictional film in the format of a documentary. So the film is pretending to be a documentary, but it isn't really, it's a fictional film. So it will use the techniques of documentary, like so-called live interviews, so-called archival photos, but it's actually a fictional film. So we have two examples of what is called a mockumentary film, a fictional film that is pretending to be a documentary. In the lower left, a film called This Is Spinal Tap, very good comic film by a director named Rob Reiner, and he basically tells the story as a pseudo-documentary of an English heavy metal rock and roll band called Spinal Tap on one of their final tours of their career. The film is very, very funny. There is no real band called Spinal Tap. It's a made-up band. There is no real filmmaker called Marty DeBergi. Again, it's a fictional persona that Rob Reiner assumes. But the film passes itself off as a cinema verite documentary of the events unfolding on this tour. We pretend that the so-called production crew is following the band on its final tour. In the middle, very interesting film by Woody Allen called Zelig, in which he created a story about a fictional character named Leonard Zelig, who is supposed to have lived in the early 20th century during the Jazz Age. And what was done was actually, again, pseudo-interviews were conducted with supposed characters who had actually met and known Zelig, and digitally, images of Zelig were placed in famous historical photos, and images of Zelig were also digitized into famous historical stock footage. So it looks as if Zelig is actually interacting with famous historical figures. The film passes itself off as a documentary, but it's not actually a documentary. Finally, in the case of mockumentary, we have Sacha Baron Cohen's film Borat. Now, Borat is actually somewhat close to a real documentary because although Borat is not a real person, he's a made-up character played by Sacha Baron Cohen. What happens in the film Borat and in Sacha Baron Cohen's later film Bruno is that in character playing the character Borat, Sacha Baron Cohen interacts with real people as he takes a tour across America. He does the same thing in Bruno. So the reactions that you're getting from the people who are interacting with him are actually real, and he acts in various outrageous ways, which make the film very humorous. So the film is a false documentary about a false character. However, the reactions from the people that he's interacting with in the film are actually genuine reactions. The people who he's interacting with don't know he's a made-up character or that he's an actor who is playing in character. So these are generally the types of the modes of screen reality that we generally associate with what we call realism. Documentary itself is considered to be a separate mode of screen reality. The reasons for this is that documentaries are usually about real events. They're usually about things that really happened, and they're not dramatized. They generally use archival or reconstructed footage from the time that the events took place, and they use interviews with people who witnessed the events that took place, and will often feature discussions with people who are considered to be experts as well. So, we tend to assume that documentaries, in fact, are far more real than even ordinary fictionally realistic films. However, we often forget that documentaries are often constructed to present some sort of an argument, or that documentaries, again, are constructed by nature of what they include and what they exclude to sometimes give us an incomplete or a false perception of an issue. So, we tend to assume that documentaries must be real because they are telling us the stories of real events using archival, not reconstructed footage, but we have to be careful in that they are actually very carefully structured. So documentaries often follow a tradition of political advocacy. Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit 9/11 and his more recent film Fahrenheit 11/9, Morgan Spurlock's film Super Size Me, these are documentary films, here they are on the right, which are supposedly presenting us real footage, real people who are affected by the events are talking, but these films are actually presenting arguments. They're carefully constructed to present a point of view. Morgan Spurlock's film Super Size Me is presenting the point of view that McDonald's is very misleading in the way it advertises its product. Fahrenheit 9/11 and Fahrenheit 11/9 are films that are carefully constructed to make arguments about the state of the United States in 2004 and in 2017, and arguing that the presidents and the presidencies that were in place in those time periods are dangerous. So these documentaries fall under what is called the tradition of advocacy. They are documentaries that express political positions. Some documentary films engage in what we call visual poetry. They're constructed not so much to give us an impression of real events, but to express poetic and stylized properties of the cinema. So we've already seen one of these, not Night in Fog, Man with a Movie Camera. So this is a film that is edited to give you a poetic impression of what a day in Moscow must have been like, although the movie is actually made over several months in about 3 different cities, and the movie is very carefully edited to follow a sequence of events from morning to afternoon to night, and right at the center of the film we see a marriage and a divorce and a birth and a funeral. So this movie also is very heavily influenced by constructivist art. So we see that there's a real fascination with machinery going on in the movie, as constructionists were generally concerned with. Night in Fog is another documentary that we'll be seeing in correspondence with this lesson that does sort of overlaps between the tradition of advocacy and the tradition of visual poetry. It is making an argument. The filmmakers are socialists, so they're using the Holocaust to make an argument about capitalism, but they are also emphasizing poetic and stylized properties of the cinema. The movie is a very, very structured movie, as we'll be discussing. The third type of documentary films that we see are what are called direct cinema. The idea behind direct cinema is that it is to minimize the filmmaker's overt manipulation of the camera. The camera is simply planted among real people in real situations. The camera captures whatever it captures, and the documentary film simply presents whatever the camera has captured. So this is called direct cinema or cinema verite. Ideally, the filmmakers are supposed to be taking a step back and just letting the camera record what it will. A very famous direct cinema documentary was made by Frederick Wiseman. It was called Capturing the Friedmans, and it was simply a bunch of cameras were planted around the house of a family named the Friedmans, and the film supposedly recorded them interacting in their everyday lives. Now, another famous example of this style of documentary filmmaking, direct cinema, is Hoop Dreams, which basically followed 5 children in families, and these were impoverished families, and in each of these 5 families, one child was showing very, very strong, precocious talent in the area of basketball. So the families were each placing all of their financial and economic hopes on the fact that the child could get a basketball scholarship and become an NBA star and make the family rich. So very interesting documentary there. Another direct cinema documentary that I'm very fond of is a documentary done about the country band, the Dixie Chicks, called Shut Up and Sing. It's basically a documentary of what happens to the band in the aftermath of 2003 when they made their comment that they were ashamed to come from Texas during the invasion of Iraq and the consequences of that comment to the career of the Dixie Chicks. Again, it purports to be direct cinema. The filmmakers are simply planting the camera in front of the people and letting the camera record what it will, with as little coaching or prompting from the filmmakers. Now, the thing to realize with direct cinema is, firstly, the people know the cameras are there, so they are likely altering their behavior because they know they're being filmed. And there's generally a window of time that it takes for the people to get used to the fact that they're being filmed, and they'll start behaving naturally again. Secondly, we have no way of knowing what's been left out in the editing room, in the cutting room. And again, the editor might just simply have decided to snip out all of the uninteresting bits, as Godard decided to do with his famous jump cuts, or the editor, anybody that is familiar with film editing, for instance, is aware of the degrees to which, if you look at those shows like Survivor or The Bachelor, you can actually, through editing, create conversations between people that never actually happened. So this is something to take into account with direct cinema or cinema verite. The film can be heavily edited after the fact to actually give you a very skewed version of the events that supposedly took place. Now, we talked about this a little in the lesson in film history. We'll discuss it more. Expressionism is considered to be an important mode of screen reality. Expressionism, we first see it from visual art in the late 19th century. Alright, so here is an image of a very famous painting by a painter named Edvard Munch called The Scream. And you'll notice that this painting, it's from the late 19th century, but it's not attempting to be realistic at all. You'll notice that the face just uses very general shapes, a pear shape, round eyes, round mouth, The sky is just represented with orangey red colors. The boardwalk is represented with brown colors. This painting is not trying to look realistic. This painting is instead trying to get you to relate to it emotionally. And what expressionist art is all about is using visual images not to record what can be seen, not to record how the subject would be visually seen accurately, but to give you visual images that give a sense of the inner emotional reality of the subject. So here, what we're seeing is a subjective impression of that is trying to give us a sense of the emotional turmoil that this person is experiencing while they're screaming. So this is considered to be one of the great expressionist paintings. Why is it important to our discussion of expressionism? Because, as I mentioned in our lesson in film history, after the First World War, the German film industry was completely smashed. It was very hard to get resources. It was very hard to get financing. So any films that could be made had to be made cheaply, and there was simply no way they could that the German film industry could compete with the mainstream Hollywood film industry on its own terms. Remember, at this point, films are still silent, so all films are internationally released because all you need to do to release a film in another market is just to change the language of the title cards, and people can enjoy the film in any part of the world. So, German filmmakers started to, in terms of photography, production design, and performance, started to adopt the aesthetics of the expressionist painters, and a movement develops in German cinema we call classic German expressionism in the early 1920s. German expressionist films present a world that is visually distorted because the world is trying to not again present the world as we might experience it objectively or realistically, as we did in the still and rear window we saw a little earlier. The film is trying to give us a sense of the emotional, psychological state of the characters or the events that, or how the events that unfold in the film are impacting the psychological state of the characters. And you can also have, again, expressionism existing within a realist frame. So a film might up front seem like a realist film, but we'll use images that draw heavily from the from German expressionism. We saw a still of Taxi Driver a little earlier in the course. Travis, as he gets angry, is surrounded by all of these red colors, and his final breakdown is signified by the fact that he shaves his head and puts on sunglasses. So this would be right out of the German expressionist playbook, even though Taxi Driver is considered to be a realist film. Here's the example of Travis from Taxi Driver. So again, his physical appearance is changed. You have sunglasses now, which make his head seem like a bit of a skull, and you have this Mohawk-style haircut being adopted by him, and this is signaling at the end of the movie that he's had his breakdown, and he's literally about to go on the warpath. He's about to go on a shooting rampage through town. On the top right, we have an image of the vampire from, I should know this off the top of my head, from the early 1920s classic vampire film Nosferatu, which is one of the first screen adaptations of Dracula. Now, the vampire in this film, he is constantly associated with rats throughout the film. So this is not a tuxedo-wearing, charming vampire with an accent and hypnotic eyes. Notice how his face, again, is very elongated. Notice how he's given pointed ears, and his hands have, again, these claws or talons. So the vampire looks visually rat-like. So again, the exterior in Expressionism is conveying to you an interior reality about an interior psychological state. Now, fantasy films we're familiar with straight up. Fantasy films present settings or characters or subjects that are in alternate realms than our own. The Lord of the Rings films take place in an imaginary, what is called a secondary world called Middle-earth. The Narnia films take place in Narnia. The Harry Potter films sort of straddle between our world and a wizarding realm in a school called Hogwarts. Avatar takes place on a planet called Pandora. And this imagined world, which usually has its own consistent rules, is again established through production design and special effects. Now, even though the films often portray worlds that are supposed to be completely different than ours and operate according to completely different rules than ours, fantasy still attempts to make the film real credible for the viewer in some way, so the viewer will find it plausible. So often, shooting will occur on real locations, so even though Avatar is supposed to be a completely made-up realm, people are still wandering through a forest. How do we know that other planets will have a forest? We don't know that, but that's just put in there so that we accept the fantasy film. It seems more real to us. Fantasy is also made more credible by accumulating narrative detail, so giving us all kinds of information about the place, the fantasy realm, so that we accept it as a realistic place with its own set of rules. So early on in The Wizard of Oz, the Munchkins, through direct dialogue, basically tell us that Dorothy has just landed on the Wicked Witch of the East. The Wicked Witch of the East has a sister called the Wicked Witch of the West. There is a yellow brick road which leads to the Emerald City, which is the main place in Oz, and that Oz is run by a wizard called the Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So all of these little details that we're given helps us to accept the fact that this is the reality of the moment. We'll pretend that Oz is a real place for the reality of the moment. Again, the first 15 minutes of the first Lord of the Rings movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, establishes clearly that what we're about to see in the three movies is based on events that have taken place in the far history of this place called Middle-earth. So we learn very quickly that this place called Middle-earth has its own history, its own customs, and its own little villages. So all of these details go together, along with the production design, along with the special effects, and along with the fact that it's up on the screen and it appears realistic to us. We call this perceptual realism. We accept the alternate realm as the reality of the moment. So we accept the Wizarding World and Hogwarts as real places when we watch the Harry Potter films because we're given all kinds of details about them. We accept Narnia as a real place because we're given all types of details about it. We accept Middle-earth as a real place because we're given all kinds of details about Middle-earth. The next mode of screen reality that we'll discuss is the mode of screen reality that we refer to as self-reflexivity. So movies that are actually conscious of the fact that they're movies, they acknowledge that they themselves are a storytelling medium. They do this by very deliberately referring back to other movies. There are basically two forms that we see of this self-reflexivity. The first is what is called a comic form, and this refers to movies which acknowledge that they are a movie and acknowledge other movies in a manner that is supposed to be humorous. So in several movies by Woody Allen, for instance, he will suddenly break character and speak directly to the screen. There's a very funny scene in this film called Annie Hall when he and his girlfriend are having a bit of an argument. His girlfriend says something and then 2 seconds later denies that she said it. He actually turns to the camera, addresses the audience directly and said, "You guys all heard that, right? She said that." So this would be an example of comic self-reflexivity. The movie is acknowledging that there's an audience out there, which means that it's acknowledging it's a movie to get a comic effect. Another example of this is seen in a film by Woody Allen called Stardust Memories. He actually plays a film director attending a film festival where a retrospective of all of his movies are being shown. So the movie itself is a bit of a meditation on movie making. We saw this very strongly in Persona and The Man with the Movie Camera. The movies are constantly reminding you that they're a movie, and just in case you forget, you suddenly get a shot of the editor working and assembling shots, as you do in The Man with a Movie Camera, or you suddenly get the film itself breaking as it's projected, showing the director working on the set with all of the lights, as you do in Persona. So this is what is meant by self-reflexivity. Didactic self-reflexivity occurs when the movie is making you aware that it's a movie in order to enhance its message. So in this still, we see on the top right, this is a still from Jean-Luc Godard's film, Breathless. And in a very famous scene, the hero of the film, Jean-Paul Belmondo, he's walking down the street, he walks past a theater, he sees a movie theater, he sees posters of Humphrey Bogart, he very famously takes his cigarette, puts it to his lips in the way that the French do with their hands sort of backward, takes a drag, looks at the screen and says, "Bogey." The Breathless itself is a gangster film. He is acknowledging other gangster films in the middle of the gangster film, so this is just one of the many things that Godard does in Breathless as an example of self-reflexivity. He acknowledges that the movie is a movie. Godard wants you to think of his movies as movies. Now, this is a still from Spike Lee's film Do the Right Thing, in which a character named Radio Raheem walks up to the camera. Ostensibly, he's speaking to another character called Mookie, so we're seeing this shot from what is supposedly Mookie's point of view. Radio Raheem walks up to the camera and, surprise, surprise, he's wearing brass knuckles that spell out the words love and hate. And he basically then proceeds to give a paraphrased version of Robert Mitchum's famous dialogue about the struggle between love and hate in Spike Lee's film Do the Right Thing. So again, this is an example of self-reflexivity. The movie is acknowledging that it is a film among other films. All right. Animation. Animation is considered to be an entirely different mode of screen reality because animation, unlike other modes of screen reality, is often not concerned with being realistic at all, and often tries to use abstract images or creatures and characters that we would never see in our everyday lives. We would never see a mouse walking on two legs who can talk to us. We would never see a dog like Goofy walking around on two legs who could talk to us. We would never see a baby elephant who has giant ears that can make him fly. So animation is trying to create a consistent reality, consistent um, world that we can relate to, but it's not necessarily meant to be experienced by us as realistic at all. Traditionally, animation was accomplished by drawing a background, usually making a painting of a background, and then anything that was going to be in the foreground would be painted onto transparent pieces of cellophane. So when the images are actually captured by the camera, one transparent image of a foreground character is placed against the background, a frame of film is taken, that cell is moved off, a new transparent cell is placed on, with the same character having moved slightly, that image is captured. The a next transparent cell is placed on the background again, that image is captured, and so on and so forth, so we get this illusion of movement. So here we have some very famous images of traditional 2D animation. This is from a still from Steamboat Willie, which is actually Walt Disney's first short featuring Mickey Mouse. So Mickey Mouse himself is a character drawn on a transparent foreground, and the boat is placed on a canvas in the background. Here again we have Dumbo. Again, characters are placed in the foreground on a transparent cell. Action takes place in the background, and here we have a similar still from Max Fleischer's film Gulliver's Travels. And again, you see Gulliver in the foreground on a transparent cell, and then the environment is placed in the background. And yes, one new foreground cell needs to be created. 24 of them need to be created for each second of finished film. Now you'll notice that there's minimal 3D depth information aside from the lines that you're given in the drawing here. The image appears to be a little flat. Same thing here with the images of Dumbo and of Gulliver. The action appears to be taking place on one plane. The first feature-length cartoon was actually Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was released in 1937. This film, Gulliver's Travels, was released very shortly thereafter. And in the 1930s, after the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, it was decided that there was an issue with the lack of depth with animation, which made the final images not as convincing as the filmmakers would have liked them to be. So what was created was called a multiplane camera to give more convincing depth effects. And the multiplane camera was used on Walt Disney's great experimental animation film, Fantasia. So here is the multiplane camera, and you can see that the camera is mounted above several different panes of glass. There are 4 of them, and then there is an image at the background of the bottom. Now, each of these panes of glass has a partial image of a foreground. So here you have some trees in the foreground painted on a transparent cell. Here you have a roadway in the background painted on, leading to a house painted on a transparent cell. Here you have some clouds painted on a transparent cell, and here you have the moon painted on a transparent cell. Now, with these 4 images, these 4 transparent cells at a different distance to the camera, but still in front of a background, what the filmmakers were then able to do was, by zooming in while capturing individual frames, so they would zoom in slightly, you actually get a sensation that you're walking through the background. The trees in this front image appear to glide by you, so the camera actually seems to be moving down this pathway in the second image. The house will get closer However, the clouds and the moon will still appear to be in the background. So this is Disney's famous multiplane camera, used very effectively in their great experimental film, Fantasia. If you haven't seen Fantasia, I highly recommend you give it a look. Nowadays, traditional 2D animation is being displaced by 3D animation. So instead of artists actually painting a canvas using paints and painting individual transparent cells to be placed in front of the background to create the illusion of movement, now environments are being created using 3D animation in exactly the same way that environments are now created to create CGI environments. So traditional animation on 2D animation is now being displaced by 3D animation. Disney's film Beauty and the Beast, for instance, was one of the first feature-length animated films to actually use CGI animation rather than traditional cell on painted background animation. This allowed for the same visual effects that you would have available in live-action films. So now, using computer animation, you can actually create effects where the camera appears to be moving through space with a great deal more flexibility than you can achieve with a multiplane camera. Another style of animation that's becoming very popular is performance capture animation. And what happens in performance capture animation is that an actor is hired to portray a character, and you'll notice that, so this is the actor Andy Serkis, who portrays the character, he portrayed the character Gollum in the Lord of the Rings films. He portrays this character Caesar in the Planet of the Apes films as well. The actor wears a suit with all kinds of painted dots on the suit, and he actually has dots of makeup placed on his face as well. The actor gives their performance, records facial expressions, and records movements. Then, basically, a CGI image is placed on top of the information that has been provided when the actor's performance has been captured, and the CGI character itself appears to be adopting exactly the same movements as the actor and exactly the same facial expressions as the actor. So this has enabled animators to create much more realistic facial expressions and much more detailed movements than have ever been created before. This also, we now see a crossover between, and a lot of overlap between animation as a mode of screen reality and fantasy as a mode of screen reality as well. Fantasy is now beginning to adopt, is on quite a regular basis, techniques that we would have previously have associated with animation. All right, I hope you've enjoyed our lesson on modes of screen reality. Please let me know if you have any questions.